To start this story, I need to mention that it should probably have a content warning. What happened was tragic, and certainly traumatizing for myself and everyone else involved. And if your listeners have trouble listening to violent situations, I highly recommend that they not listen to this story. I grew up in a very quiet neighborhood. There was rarely anything that happened in the area, and the only time I remember the cops being out there, besides this instance, was when one of the kids from a nearby area decided to break into a house that was for sale. Nothing violent ever happened on the block, and there was never any reason for anyone to think anything would. Every year, around Halloween, the houses would decorate with some subtle decorations and lights, nothing too creepy. The kids from the neighborhood would walk around and trick or treat, and even the social holidays like this were pleasant. My parents were the picture of suburban life. My dad was a financial advisor, always dressing nicely, and my mom stayed home, but she was pretty involved with the local library and ran the local book club. There was a point in my childhood where my dad started changing. He was always a social person, always friendly and talkative, but at some point he started listening to a certain radio show and then reading some things online. This was '03, so the internet was a bit more of the Wild West. And he started on this streak of paranoia that became borderline obsessive. It started subtle enough. He had changed the locks on the front door and then added a chain lock, the kind where you can look out but not open the door all the way. Our front door didn't have a window, so you had to either look out the window that was close by or open the door to see who was there. Then, he added these motion-activated floodlights that would light up the neighborhood like a stadium any time one of the neighbor cats would cross our yard. My mom would joke that he was preparing for the apocalypse, with how much he was securing the house, but I could tell by the look on her face that she was concerned. Our front door had a motion sensor on it. It ended up with 4 locks. All of our windows were all but bolted shut, and he was starting to hoard canned goods in the basement. He was pretty much a bunker away from being a full-on prepper. That year, on the day before Halloween, actually, I had come home after a long day of school and then soccer practice to find my dad at the kitchen table, surrounded by tools and a stack of new security cameras. This was early 2000s, so they weren't the kind that you can get today. They were all fully wired and required to have that central box connecting all the units. When I asked what he was doing, he responded with, "I'm going to put up cameras. This way, I'll be able to watch all directions around the house. With these bad boys, no one is going to sneak up on us." I wanted to ask him who exactly it was that he was expecting to sneak up on us. But by this point, talking to him was almost feeling like a chore. Everything was about security. Everything was about, quote, keeping us safe. Which I understand to a point, but at the same time, safe from what? We lived in a suburb where everyone else knew everyone else. And while I understand not getting complacent, we really weren't in much danger. My dad spent that entire night putting up the cameras. He didn't even make dinner for me, so when my mom got home at 8 from the book club and I hadn't eaten, she was pretty upset with him. There was definitely some yelling at that point. I think my mom had had enough as well. That night, I was lying in bed just thinking about life, as preteens often do, and I was watching the clouds pass in front of the moon when I heard someone talking. I could hear my dad's voice, angry and demanding. And then I heard what sounded like desperate yells from someone else. I was curious. I was a kid, so I wanted to know what was going on. I crept out of bed and down the hallway into the living room, and what I saw made my blood run cold. I saw my dad standing in the middle of the living room, his face flush with a mix of fear and rage. his shoulders hunched. I saw my mom standing in the door to the kitchen, one hand pressed to her mouth, and I could tell that she was panicking. Then I saw something confusing. The front door was open, and there was a man that I had never seen standing there in the doorway, with his hands up trying to say something. But it was like he couldn't speak out of sheer terror. And then I saw why he was terrified. My dad was holding a handgun trained right on him. Now, I want to say that I completely understand the need for defense and security. I want that to be clear. And I do personally appreciate the Second Amendment, but this situation, it wasn't it. I want to point out that the front door was open. There were 4 locks on that door, which I now know to mean that my dad had opened it. I don't know if he knew the guy was out there. I don't know if it was just a random run-in of the 2 men, but the fact that my dad had a gun on him, a gun that neither my mom nor I even knew that he had, and that he had just installed the security cameras that watched every square inch of the yard, makes me think that my dad knew this man was at our door, and that he had basically created this scenario. I don't know if it was because he wanted it to happen, or if his paranoia had gotten so bad that he felt like he needed to take it head on, but it is what it is. My dad kept screaming at this man to not move, but then also screamed at him to get on his knees. Conflicting instructions that I could tell were causing a panic in this man. When I got into the living room from the hallway, I did something that I will always regret, because I feel like it made the situation worse. I asked what was going on. The man looked at me, and I could tell that he was crying. My dad shot me a look over the shoulder and yelled, "Get back in your room!" I just stood there in confused silence, watching this scenario not move for several seconds, until the man lowered his arms and started trying to talk. I'm sure he just wanted to explain why he was there, but my dad didn't give him the chance. The second the man dropped his arms, my dad pulled the trigger. I stood there and watched my dad squeeze off 5 shots, all of them hitting the man, who stumbled back and then fell to the ground. The silence that followed that moment was so deep and all-consuming that, for a second, I thought I had gone deaf. My dad's face was frozen, his mouth slightly open, and his gun still aiming at where the man had been standing. My mom broke the silence when she started sobbing and screaming at my dad, asking what he had done. I swear it was mere seconds before I heard the sound of police sirens and saw the lights in front of our house. The cops ran up with their weapons drawn, yelling at my dad to drop his gun as they tried to figure all of this out. I think that was when my dad realized that he was still holding it, because he actually looked confused and scared when he put it on the ground. They did pull him out of the house to talk to him, and they then talked to my mom and I as they tried to figure out the bloody scene on our front porch. To kind of wrap this up as quickly as I can, the man was a neighbor. He lived on the street behind ours. I had never seen him before, but he apparently lived one road over in a house that kind of looked similar to ours. Come to find out, he had actually been drinking at a bar down the way. He'd had way too many, and he had walked home, but at some point he must have gotten confused and turned down our road and got to our house. Now, I don't know if he tried to open the door or if he had just knocked or something, but I'm guessing that my dad saw him and opened the door to confront him, which was the wrong way to handle this situation. The end of the investigation determined that it was a tragic accident, but that my father was defending himself and his family, so it was considered justified. I don't think that tragic is a strong enough word for what happened, but I don't have the vocabulary to say what it really was. This man was drunk and confused, and did nothing more than stumble up to the wrong house. He wasn't armed. He didn't break in. And my dad created the scenario where his life was in danger more than he had. It got worse when I found out that this guy was actually the father to a girl in my class. She was out of school for a while, but when she came back, I couldn't ever get the nerve to talk to her. What was I supposed to say? Hey, sorry my dad killed yours? It may not sound related, but my family never celebrated Halloween after that. My dad never put out the decorations, and we never carved pumpkins again. I think this took a toll on my dad, and he never wanted anyone to come up to our front porch at night ever again. I will say that my dad was also never the same after that night. He kept up his paranoia, but he became less social, less talkative, and less involved in my life until he eventually died of a massive heart attack at 48. I'm not sure that there's a lesson to this story, other than to say that security is important, but it's also important to never will a scenario where you shoot a man for protection into existence. There's a certain point where, in his pursuit for security, my father became a hammer. And when you're a hammer, you do everything you can to find a nail. In my third year of college, I decided I wanted to get my own place to live instead of staying in the dorms. I wanted my own space. I wanted to know that my stuff was safe and that no one was going to take it or borrow any of it, like what tended to happen in the dorms. I had also had a decent paying job and saved up enough to afford all the fees and deposits first. I was just ready to be out on my own. Now, I have seen videos, such as yours, and even a show dedicated to crazy neighbors, but it's something you just don't think about until it actually happens to you. And even then, you may not see it until someone else points it out. But I had some neighbors that, even without speaking, they let their creep vibes show full time. I found a nice community that had townhomes within my price range, and I was approved and moved in pretty quickly. I don't know if they're the same everywhere, so I'll just explain the outline of ours. Their townhomes were connected in a square shape with one open side. They had about 6 of these, I believe, because they were back to back. My place was in the center row, second from the left, so I had one neighbor to my left, they were the corner unit, and one to my right. For the first couple of weeks, everything went as normal. There were a few nearby neighbors that waved at me. I almost ran into my neighbor on the right, which is how I met them. It was 2 sisters living together with no kids and 2 very large dogs. Very nice people. But my neighbors to the left, I had yet to see any of them for about the month or so that I lived there. As I was coming home from classes, I happened to look up to see a young boy in front of their bay window. I love kids, and since I hadn't met them yet, I smiled and waved, but he just continued to stare at me, unmoving, and with no expression on his face. It was kind of odd, but I just shrugged it off as a kid thing. Maybe he was shy and didn't want to wave. Not a big deal. So I went about my business. But then, I went to leave for work that evening, and as I got in my car and went to start it, I spotted not only the boy, but what looked like an older kid. The boy looked maybe 6 or 7, and the girl stood taller and was maybe 11 or 12. Now they were both staring at me, emotionless. I smiled and waved again, but I got the same results. Nothing. Okay, so maybe both kids were shy. But it got even weirder. For a few days, I would see just those 2 kids staring out the window, following me as I walked to my door and when I left. It was definitely strange being watched almost daily, but it wasn't like it was hurting me, so I never said or did anything about it. I was curious because I would be home in the afternoons, sometimes, or on my day off, and they would still be there. Did they not go to school? Maybe they were homeschooled. I had no idea. Then there was a day that I came home from work and had been talking to my mom on the phone. I was sitting in my car as I finished my conversation, and I watched as two more people approached the window. This time it looked like a middle-aged woman and an even older woman. If I had to guess, it looked like a whole family generation there. Grandma, mother, and the kids. But what caught my attention was that they approached the kids, looked down at them, and then looked out the window directly at me. So now I had 4 of them staring at me. What the heck? Since I was on the phone already, I told my mom about what I was witnessing, and at first my mom chuckled and said that maybe they were just really nosy people and watched others. She even said that I should bring them something and introduce myself and see if that helps. And I laughed at the idea because it sounded so old school. But I knew she was probably right. I ran into my other neighbors and they brought me cookies, so it wasn't too far off. I thought the idea over and what exactly I could do, trying to be considerate to allergies or whatever too. I'd been pretty busy between work and school lately, so I hadn't gotten around to following through with those plans, but their staring never missed a beat. Anytime I was outside, they were at the window. Sometimes it was just the kids. Most of the time, it was all 4 of them. Then it just kept escalating. I decided to take a walk after I got home from my classes, and as I left, the 4 of them were in the window. I smiled and waved and got the same response, which was nothing. So I began my walk. But when I circled back around and was walking down the sidewalk leading to my place, I looked up feeling eyes on me. Now, the complete family was there. The kids, the mom, the grandma, and now what appeared to be the dad and grandpa. The adults were all in black, and the kids seemed to be wearing matching red outfits. They had the same deep red-looking shirts with black ruffled collars. Why was the whole family now staring at me? And it was all the same. Emotionless, unwavering stares. It was kind of creepy. Now with everyone present, I waved again, standing right outside their window. They didn't move. They just looked like unsettling dressed-up statues. After going inside, I really tried to rationalize it. Maybe they were just nosy people. Based on how they were dressed and how the kids didn't appear to go to school, I thought maybe it was a religious thing even. And I felt bad, thinking I was being very judgmental. So I made a mental note that I should really try to introduce myself. Maybe at the very least, they will realize that I noticed them doing this and stop. But another few days passed, and I came home in a bit of a mood. All 6 of them slowly made their way to the window and watched me walk into my home. I had just gotten back from the store where I bought some cinnamon rolls, so after I baked them, I wrapped them up on a platter and went next door. As I walked over, I noticed one of the kids still sitting at the window. But as I walked up their steps and got closer to look at him, I noticed how his face was really red and puffy, like he had been crying. Why was he crying? I waved and pointed to the platter, but again, I got nothing out of him. So I just knocked on the door. No response. I stepped back and saw that both kids were now there and Grandma, and all 3 of them looked like they were crying. What the heck was going on? I knocked again and then shouted towards the window that I brought them something, but they just stared. Then everyone else slowly walked to the window and stared. Now all 6 of them were back, in their same creepy outfits, staring at me. Unmoving, emotionless. No one flinched at the doorbell or the knocking. No one answered. Why? Why did they just continue to stare at me? I looked around to see if anyone was watching, and I went down and around the stairs and towards the window. The houses were a little raised, so as I got closer, the bottom of the window was at chest level for me. The moment the kids looked down at me, something in me told me that this wasn't right. It was like this overwhelming sensation telling me to get the hell out of there. I sat the cinnamon rolls down on the steps and took off back inside my place. Not that I expected them to come stare at me, but I closed up my curtain and locked my door. What the hell was up with these people? And why did it seem like they only ever stared at me? I tried to get my mind off of it, but it was difficult. I had too many questions. And what, if anything, could I even do about it? Nothing. They literally just stared at me. They weren't at my window. They were in their own place. And what would I even say? Hey, have you noticed the weird family that likes to stare in 905? I really didn't know anyone well enough to strike up an unusual conversation like that. I knew the girls next door, but we've only ever talked in passing. So I was just stuck with this. Every day. Every single time I left the house, they were watching me. They watched me walk, they watched me come and go, and the plate of cinnamon rolls I left, well, it sat there for 3 days, untouched, before I finally grabbed them and threw them away. I wasted my money, but did they not even leave in those 3 days? What did they do for a living? Did any one of them work? It was such a bizarre thing to witness. And getting up close and seeing the kids' red puffy eyes that just stared into my soul, I could never forget. I tried watching on days that I was off, early in the morning, late at night, and I never saw anyone leave or anyone enter. No deliveries, nothing. We could pay rent online, so I guess they could do that too, but how did they get food? Toiletries? I eventually just had to drop it and accept that I just had these really creepy neighbors that I could do nothing about. For a year, I dealt with this, and even when I had people over, they witnessed it. But when my lease came up for renewal, I begged to move to a different townhome, asking for one with a fireplace. The fireplace ones are only on the end of the strips of homes, so I wouldn't be anywhere near them. Thankfully, they obliged, and I got to move and never to be stared at again. Sometimes I would drive by to see if they were still there, and every once in a while, I would still see someone staring out that window. From the summer of 2021 to 2022, I was a lifeguard at a small beach called Adams Point Beach, which is located in Queechy Lake, New York. I didn't really enjoy my job, to be honest. Besides making friends with the other lifeguards, I wasn't getting paid enough money, and my final paycheck for the summer of 2021 was $350. To make matters even more difficult, I come from a family with no money. I live on a farm and my parents fight with each other a lot. I never went to college because my family can't afford it, so I have to work 2 jobs every day. One from 9 to 5 and the other from 6 to 11, where I only get paid $15 an hour. In the summer of 2022, my boss, for whatever reason, had demoted me to a sub-lifeguard. This really pissed me off because I couldn't see my friends. One day in August of 2022, I was called in to substitute for a lifeguard as this lifeguard was busy that day, and only one other lifeguard was available. Usually there are 3, but that day was a shortage of staff. The start of that day was like how a day would usually start. Unfortunately, that changed in the afternoon. My 30-minute shift on this lifeguard chair was done, and the other lifeguard swapped with me. I walked back to the shed and went inside of it. About 10 minutes later, while I was on my phone, I heard a bunch of screaming and crying outside of the shed with the door closed. I didn't know what was going on, so I walked outside, and what I saw next is an image that I will never unsee for the rest of my life. What I saw was the lifeguard along with 4 other people, sitting with a woman on a surf rescue board with both of her legs severed off. I felt petrified, but I had to help the other lifeguard as it was my job to save people. I helped carry the surfboard, but I looked behind me as it was so brutal to look at what was in front of me. I helped everyone place the board on a table with the woman lying on it right next to the shed. Thankfully, the police and medics were already called. I asked what had happened. One guy said that a guy by himself in a speedboat wasn't looking where he was driving the boat, and people told him to stop and slow down, but he was in his own world. He then ran over the woman, and then would come to a stop like 3 seconds later. He apparently took off like a coward would do. I could not believe what I was hearing. I then told the man to describe what the speedboat looked like. I asked him because this was a very small lake, and I pretty much knew everyone who comes to this lake and lives right next to it. He said that it was a blue jet boat. When the man told me this, I felt as if my whole world was coming to an end. That was my dad's boat. He's the only one who owns a jet boat on this lake. I then saw everything turn blurry, and then it all went to black. I woke up with 2 EMTs side by side next to me. They asked if I was all right. I told them I was fine, and I went to go grab my water bottle and then drank the water as if I had never drank water before in my life. I then exited the beach area as my boss told everyone to go home because of what had happened today. I got in my car and drove home, which was about 3 to 4 minutes away. As I got home, I turned off my car and stepped out to see my dad pacing back and forth nervously through the kitchen window. I then rushed inside of the house, and I went on a full-on rampage on my father. I confronted him and then called him a coward for leaving the scene of the accident. He was breathing so hard. I had never seen him breathing like this before. As I was still yelling at him and my adrenaline was kicking in more than ever, I shoved him and then started hitting him. He told me to calm the F down. After about 10 hits, I finally pushed him to his full limits, and he punched me so hard that I fell to the ground, and my ears were ringing. He then yelled at me to stay the F down, you little B, before running out of the house and speeding off somewhere. I continued to bawl my eyes out. I was never close with my dad. I never came to him for help when needed, but never in a million years would I thought that he would end up doing something so horrific. About an hour and a half later, my mom finally came home after going to the hospital to check on the woman whom my father had injured. As my mother walked through the door, she hugged me for what felt like an eternity, and we cried together. We sat down together at the dinner table, and she told me some good news and bad news. The good news was that the woman was alive and okay. The bad news was that both of her legs were amputated off, and that they would have to be refitted with bionic legs. I felt so relieved that she had survived, but I was still so devastated that my father took off, never even apologized, and never came to see the woman in the hospital. My mother asked me where her husband went. I told my mom that he took off. We tried calling him, but it went straight to voicemail. The police were called again, and we filed a missing persons report on my dad. In the next few weeks, the police tried searching everywhere for him and came up empty-handed. It was the worst 3 weeks of my life. I quit my job straight after due to the traumatic sight I had seen on that very day. I've been seeing a psychologist 3 times a week now. Each day I was very slowly starting to get better and better, but I still have a long way to go. I also only work one job now, and have been promoted at my job, which now I get paid 25 an hour. This makes me happier as I still have some luck in this world. I have not seen my father since. I don't really miss him that much after he attacked me and calling me a B. I wish I could tell you that that's where the story ends, but sadly it isn't. And the next part gets even worse. Fast forwarding to sometime in mid-July during this past summer of 2024, I decided to go kayaking at 7 o'clock at night. I wanted to exercise my brain and needed some free time for myself. I took off in my kayak. I kayaked in the area of around 30 feet deep, then kayaking to the shallower area. My destination was to stop at a land area to walk on it and to take a break from kayaking, as my arms were getting sore. During this whole time kayaking, I was looking at the water beneath me. As I got to around 15 feet deep, what I saw on the bottom of the ground underneath the water was textbook horror. I saw a dead body of an old woman. I paddled out there so fast and then reached my destination that I originally planned to go, and after pulling my kayak to shore, I ran to the grass area and threw up around 5 times. Luckily, I had my phone on me, so I called 911. The police came 10 minutes later. About 7 cop cars showed up, along with the SWAT team. I gave them my story, and they told me to evacuate the area as it will be going under investigation. About 2 weeks later, we got some of the worst news ever. More so than anyone who lived in my town had ever gotten before. The detective told us that this person was murdered. They also traced DNA and fingerprints to try to find out who the perpetrator was, and it worked. When they revealed who the killer was, I was nowhere near prepared to find out who it would be. It was my estranged father. Why the hell would he come back to this town if his main goal was to try to escape? I couldn't think of any motive of why he would even kill this person. This was so devastating that the next day, I packed most of my clothes and drove off all the way downstate to New York City. I needed a break from this so-called curse that was going on in upstate in my hometown. I stayed in New York City for about 3 weeks in a cheap hotel and then came back. The police, this time along with the FBI, searched again for my father, and yet again nothing. I quit my job after this, and I'm currently unemployed. Luckily, I have my little sister who had just graduated high school take over for me. As you were hearing this story, as of now, there is still no updates on where my father could possibly be. He could be living in another state far away, or he could have fled the country. I never want to see my father ever again after hearing that he murdered another human being. If there's more news revolving around this case, I will keep you posted. This happened to me a long time ago, when I was still in college back in the 70s. I recently started listening to your podcast, and the memory of this inexplicable event came rushing back to me. I was a junior in college at the time, living on the 5th floor of my dorm, which was also the top floor. The wing I lived on was the shortest wing, with only 4 rooms. 2 rooms with an attached bathroom between them on each side of the hallway. I didn't have a roommate this particular semester, and I lived alone in my room. My suite mates were very good friends. Each room had access to the bathroom, which was between the 2 rooms. Each room had a door to the shared bathroom that could be locked with a deadbolt for privacy and security. On this particular day that I'm writing about, my suite mates had already gone to class. I had slept in a little later than normal and got up to go to class around 10 a.m. I want to add that I was alone in my room that morning. I was not then and am not now a smoker, and I didn't have a lighter or matches in my room. No one was in my room when I left for class, and as was my habit, I made sure the bathroom door was deadbolted and my dorm room was locked when I left. I also recall not making my bed that morning, as I awoke late and had to hurry to dress and get to class. When I returned an hour later, I unlocked my room and went in. I immediately noticed the faint smell of smoke. It was odd, and not being a smoker, I couldn't understand why my room smelled of smoke. My friend who lived across the hall were smokers, but they hadn't been in my room. I started to look around for something that might be smoldering. I first went to the electric univent by the window. The univent functioned as a heater, fan, and air conditioner. I thought perhaps it was malfunctioning, but it wasn't even on. Then I checked my desk lamp cord, which was also fine. Finally, I examined my stereo system. It was the 70s, remember, in the attached speakers. Everything was fine. I couldn't find the source of the smoke anywhere. Finally, in desperation, I banged on the door of my friends across the hall. "Something's burning in my room and I can't find it," I said. They jumped up and came across the hall to my room to help me look for the source of the smell of smoke. We all searched the room together, with no results. I have a really keen sense of smell, and began to realize the smell seemed stronger near my bed. My bed was still unmade. My pillow was lying in the middle of the mattress where I had tossed it an hour earlier. The sheets and comforter were kicked off and lying rumpled at the foot of the bed. I reached down and picked up my pillow, and there in the middle of the bed where I had been sleeping an hour earlier was a smoldering fire. My pillow had been covering the charred and burning mattress, and the fire had started to burn into my pillow as well. My friend and I stared incredulously at the hole burning in the middle of my mattress. How could that happen? The mattress was ruined, as was my pillow. The down feathers gave off a putrid, acrid smell. That's what had caught my attention upon entering the room. I was flabbergasted. I had no explanation for how this could have happened. I examined both the mattress and the pillow for any cause, perhaps a match or a cigarette butt, but there was nothing. No explanation to what had caused the spontaneous combustion in the place where I had just been sleeping an hour before. My friends and I scratched our heads and just chalked it up to being one of those things that can't be explained. And that was that for a few days. It bothered me a lot, as it seemed personal and very creepy. How could something like that happen? I had no enemies, no reason for anyone to be upset or angry with me. I certainly hadn't done anything that would warrant my bed and pillow burning. It bugged me for days, to say the least. A few days had passed when one of my friends knocked on my door. I'll call him John. He came in shutting the door behind him and said, "I heard your bed burned. Is that true?" I told him yes, it was true. And then he asked me if there was anyone on campus who didn't like me. I told him that the only person who seemed to dislike me was a girl who was currently dating a boy that I had dated 2 years earlier. "What's her name?" he asked. Things were getting weird. I didn't like the way he was acting. I told him the girl's name and he jumped up and locked the door so no one else would come in. "Listen," he said, "I'm involved with some witchcraft stuff. I'm a warlock, and the girl that you mentioned is a powerful witch." I had never heard anything so bizarre in my life. I was incredulous, and I simply didn't believe him or what he was telling me, but he was dead serious. He said that she had cast some kind of weird energy spell that could light spontaneous fires. To this day, I don't know if that is truly what caused the fire or not, but I have no other explanation for it. And the fact that it was my bed and my pillow strikes me as very weird, personal, and aimed directly at me. I don't know who, what, why, or how this happened. It still haunts me to this day because I cannot rationally explain it. The only thing that makes any sense is the crazy explanation that my friend John gave me, but really? Is that even possible? A long time has passed since then, I still think of this story every once in a while, but I don't speak about it because it creeps me out. But if it was something the girl who dated my old boyfriend did, well, I certainly hope that we never meet again. I have an experience that is somewhat recent. Just a couple of months ago, actually, that I wanted to share because it was seriously chilling for me. I'm an avid runner and I do my best to not let anything get in the way of my routine, and that includes the weather. On this particular evening, it was pretty cloudy, but I was well and determined to get my run in, even if it was going to rain a little. That was a pretty stupid decision on this night, because I didn't check the forecast, so that little bit of rain ended up being a torrential downpour. I was running on my path, which was paved, but it was in a mostly undisturbed wooded area. As I was making my way down the path, it started coming down in sheets. I tried to run through it as long as I could, but then it started hailing, and that was pretty much the end of it for me. I hopped off the path and into the tree line using the trees as coverage as best as I could. I didn't have my umbrella because, again, I was very ill prepared. I figured that I would be able to just stay there for a while and wait out the storm. It had to end eventually, right? If not, I would stay there until I hit my mental limits and then make a mad dash to the parking lot to get into my car. Well, the latter ended up happening. It wasn't letting up or slowing down at all, so I just took a deep breath and took off back toward the parking lot at a full sprint. I practically jumped in my car, sopping wet, breathing heavily and my teeth chattering, just watching the rain smack the hell out of my windshield. I decided I would sit there for a little bit, again trying to see if the storm would let up some, or if I was going to have to drive home in the pouring rain. It was definitely a bit of a downer, but I thought that, whatever, I would just enjoy the sound of the storm, and then get out of there when it slowed. I leaned back in my seat and tried to get comfortable. Every few seconds, a flash lit up the area. And yes, I know it's probably not a good idea to be in the car in the woods during a storm, but it honestly felt safer than being out in the rain. As I sat there for a few minutes, I was watching the tree lines, and I thought I saw movement. At first, I assumed it was a deer or something, but I looked again and saw that it was taller than a deer and looked more like a person. My mind immediately went to, there's some poor sap out on the trail still running through the rain. And then I thought, damn, they were more committed than I was. But the way they were moving looked odd. They weren't really going in one direction. They were seemingly walking aimlessly around the trees. I watched this person for several moments just thinking, are they okay? Do they need help? Should I do something? After a couple more seconds, I decided to turn on my headlights to get a better look at whatever it was this person was doing, since it was getting later and was starting to get dark. I flicked my headlights on, and they illuminated the entire area in front of me. The trees, the path, and the figure. When they kicked on, the person turned to look in my direction, and it became immediately apparent that whatever the hell I was looking at was not a person. Or at least it was not a normal person. It's hard to figure out how to state what I was looking at, other than it was a person, sort of. They were dressed, but they weren't dressed for the weather. The person, whom I'm assuming was feminine, was wearing a white dress that looked older. Her skin was pale and it looked a bit dirty, but it wasn't until I saw her face that things got really freaky. Mostly because she didn't have one. Whatever this was, it didn't have a face. It was just flat, pale skin. I know it sounds weird, but I think the best and currently relevant way to describe it is like the nurses in Silent Hill, but without the scar. It was just flat. No eyes, no nose, no mouth. This was the most terrifying thing I have ever seen in my entire life. Not just because of what it was, but also the fact that whatever this was out in this storm in the woods. I don't know if it was something paranormal or what, but it scared the living hell out of me. I immediately started my car and took off out of the parking lot and away from the park. I half expected that thing to be chasing my car like some kind of horror movie, but it wasn't, and I didn't see it after I left. I have been back to that park numerous times, a couple of times at night, even, to see if I could find this thing again, but I've yet to see anything like it, nor have I read any local posts about it. To the best of my knowledge, I'm the only person to have seen this thing, and it was just the one time. If anyone has any ideas what this thing could have been, I'm open to thoughts, but as of right now, I have no clue. It was some kind of freaky thing in the woods, and I'm just going to pretend that it was a ghost or something because thinking that there's something that is of this world that's out there in that form is too much for me. I've had some creepy experiences myself over the years, but nothing like this one day at my house. I figured I would share it since I've now started listening to this podcast more. And again, thanks for your time. I had bought my house almost 2 years ago from the family of one of my friends, Brian. He lived there and had told me his dad and aunt were planning to sell it. The house was built in 1950 by his grandparents and great-grandparents, and his family has been the only family to live in it. I definitely didn't want to see it bought, tore down, and rebuilt. Plus, I was currently looking to build a house on the land I had bought a few years back, but building supplies were through the roof. Pun intended. Good pun. And I knew that I couldn't just simply swing that kind of project. So I sold my land for $10,000 more than I bought it for. Well done on my part, I do say, and put a good chunk of it down on getting a mortgage for Brian's house. I bought the house as is, so it's been a non-stop project, as everything is very old school and original. No complaints on original, as I've always found things built in the early to mid-1900s or older always hold up longer. Today it seems everything is built to break in a non-ending money scheme. Anyways, the house needs a lot of work. For 70 years and counting, again, I gotta say Brian's family did an impressive job with this house. But certain things needed to be replaced. The house is quiet, and the neighborhood is the same. Just a bunch of good old country folk on a hill in a small town. The true heart of America, if I may say. But that quiet neighborhood gets weird at night. Another one of my friends, Kevin, grew up on the opposite end of my gravel road. I've known Kevin since we were in 6th grade, and Brian for maybe 5 years total. But since they lived on the same road, Brian knew Kevin a long time as well. Kevin's parents still live in their house today. I've heard from him and Brian that sometimes you'll hear or feel things that might send cold chills down your spine. Another friend that comes over and watches WWE Raw and SmackDown with me, Andrew, has always said that, of all the places I go, walking outside at the end of the wrestling nights gives me the chills. My son lives out of state, and when he came up one time to stay with me in the house after I got it, we had to go back inside at night to grab something before going to stay with my mom on that particular night. He was 14 at the time, and I never told him anything about weird noises or ghosts, as I didn't want to freak him out. I followed him just in case he needed help grabbing things, and not all of the lights work. Again, constant work needs to be done on this house. so he was using his phone light to walk through the living room to the kitchen. He didn't know that I had walked in behind him, and I saw him pause, staring into the corner of the kitchen and slowly looking around, before coming back out with what he needed. I asked him what was that about, and he said, "I don't know. I just felt weird and thought I saw something." I asked what he thought he saw, and he said nothing. There was nothing there. It was more of a feeling, like he could feel that something was there. But his eyes saw nothing. Some nights are fine, but other nights, especially the ones where the moon isn't bright and the darkness is sitting strong on the hill, it has a tendency to make the bravest man's hair stand up. I'm a big guy, and I've always left my doors unlocked growing up. Some nights, it really makes even me feel uneasy. Especially the basement. I don't like the basement. Daytime is fine, but at nights, it's a no-go unless absolutely necessary. The basement floor is the actual earth as it's hand-dug, and no cement laid down. 70 years of dust and dirt make it feel even more offsetting. The best way to describe nighttime is the feeling that you're being watched. Again, the neighborhood is quiet. No crimes, no loud neighbors. A lot of older couples and families that have lived their whole lives on this hill. My neighbor is coming up on 90. Everyone's nice and helpful, and at the end of the day, everyone is armed anyway. So, definitely no need to be scared. But at night, it just feels like something is present. And it just doesn't sit right with me sometimes. I've heard about skin crawlers and all that. Kevin has mentioned shadow people chasing him as a kid before his house had plumbing, and they had an outhouse. He hated using the bathroom because he said he would sprint all the way to the doors after he went. Waking up, occasionally seeing a shadow that he couldn't explain. Just eerie stuff, you know? Weird and unexplainable. But nothing really violent. I preface all this because nighttime is when all the weird feelings and occasional noises happen. Daytime is calm and peaceful. This particular day, I had called a local electrical, plumbing, HVAC company to come out to the house and give me an estimate on work that needed to be done. They separate their workers depending on jobs, so I was to expect a plumber and then 30 minutes later an electrician, both from the same company. The plumber, Dietrich, arrived around 3 p.m. He was a big fella like me, and told me to just call him D. We chatted it up while he walked through the house and inspected all the plumbing. He started upstairs and ended with the basement. I told him an electrician was coming too from his company and that he may get blocked in the driveway. He said that it was no problem and asked if I knew which electrician. All I knew was the man's name was Rusty, because the message I got said that I could expect Rusty at around 3:30 p.m. He laughed and said, good old Russell. Obviously, he knew who I was talking about. He's a cool little guy, he said as he kept looking around. Sure enough, once he was close to being done, the electrician, Rusty, got there but pulled up in front along the road in order to not block his coworker's van. D came out with me, and a short Italian man hopped out, and it was like two old friends seeing each other again, chatting about the long drives in between stops that they had been, and where they were going next. They talked for a moment, and D had his estimate ready for me to sign. Rusty said, "Well, I guess it's my turn," and started looking around. D joined us as Rusty also started upstairs and then made his way to the basement to finish. At this point, all three of us are in the basement. I'm leaned up against the washer, listening to Rusty and D joke back and forth about how ridiculous some of the runs they go on are. "It sounds to me like you guys don't get paid enough for what you go through," I said. They both laugh, and they say it all depends. Other than our conversation, it's pretty quiet in the house when, all of a sudden, the back screen door slams upstairs. We all pause, and I'm like, damn ghosts. Really, I was just trying to clear the weird pause. We all laugh, and the topic turns to weird stories. Things that we've all heard before, like noises and stuff. Rusty says he's heard some things in a few old houses he's worked on, but that he pays them no mind. "It's always the old houses," said Rusty. It was windy, so I said, "Yeah, the back screen door doesn't always close, so sometimes it stays partially open until the wind makes it close abruptly." About 5 minutes go by. Rusty is examining the power box, Dee's in front of me, and I'm leaned against the washer still when someone with boots walks slowly from the living room upstairs to the kitchen. I say boots because it was so clearly the sound of a sturdy heel-to-foot step that's made with old cowboy boots. Not the ones with spurs or nothing like that. Just a firm foot-to-floor sound. About 7, maybe 8 steps total. Dee is looking directly at me, and I smile and say, "Did you hear that?" I had thought to myself that I was crazy, but it was so clear that it paused the conversation. Obviously, unless I'm losing my mind and hearing stuff, there's no possible way they both didn't hear that. Dee chuckled and said, Yeah, dude, someone's upstairs. Didn't you say you live alone?" I had a roommate previously, but not anymore. My dog was shut in my room, but it wasn't her knocking something over or her little dog feet. Again, this was clear boots to floor sounding steps. I was like, "Nah, man, nobody else is here except my dog." It sounded like someone with boots. Honestly, I only said that because I personally just wanted confirmation. Rusty spoke up and said, "Yeah, that definitely sounded like boots." Rusty speaking up meant that all 3 of us clearly heard someone walk right above us from the living room to kitchen. I said, "Hold up, let me check." I walked upstairs and yelled pretty loudly, "Yo," in an attempt to see if maybe Andrew or Kevin had come by. Neither ever wore boots, both were the skater/athletic type guys, so their shoes were either Vans or Nike. But at this point, I just wanted answers and was praying that they decided to cowboy up and just show up. But once I came upstairs, there was nothing. Nobody. I said, "Yo," another 2 separate times as I walked around and even looked outside. Not a trace of anyone. The house seemed quieter than normal. Just a slight whimper of my dog, Maui, wanting out. I went ahead and I let her out just so that there could be no more possible noises that were unexplainable. She may be a smaller dog, Patterdale Terrier, but she could be fierce when she wanted to be. Letting her out made me feel a little less unnerved. I went back downstairs and laughed to the guys like, "Nah, there's nobody here, for real." Honestly, if it was just me, I would have thought I was crazy, but both the guys heard it clear as day. 1 foot at a time. 7 to 8 steps. Starting in the living room, over to the kitchen. The sound even changed pitch slightly from living room rug to kitchen tile. You could tell where the steps were as whoever or whatever it was walked. Obviously boots. Rusty joked and said, "Well, all I know is I just gotta outrun you 2 big boys." We all laughed, and it eased the tension a bit, but especially Dee. I could tell that it got to him. He stayed while Rusty finished up, but this whole mood changed. He was right in front of me when it happened, and our eyes locked as it was happening. Rusty was maybe 10 feet away at the power box. Let me remind everyone that this was now around 4 p.m. in the day. Broad daylight, sun shining outside, warm late spring day. I think it was in late April, maybe early May. 3 grown men all trying to wrap our minds around what had just happened. Once they left, I called Brian. I remember him saying one time that he thought maybe his grandpa still hung around spirit-wise. I thought he was just full of crap. I said, "Hey, sorry, this is random," but then I asked him if his grandpa wore boots. He was like, "What? Why?" I said, "Just answer me, man." I tried to act normal, but I'm sure he picked up on my nerves and was like, "Yeah, man, all the time. Pretty much all he ever wore except for his house slippers on Sundays and rest days." I paused, and then I told him what had happened. He wasn't in front of me, but I could just hear in his voice that he was smiling. Maybe he just said this to calm his friend down, but in honesty, he sounded very serious and sincere. He said, "No worries, man. Grandpa was probably just going to get a cup of water from the kitchen. You're in good company. He wouldn't ever harm you." This story is 100% true. I spent the next week at my mom's, and it took me a while to get used to being at my house, especially at night. I still don't like going outside or into the basement unless I need to. Although I never felt in danger, it was just weird noises from time to time. Brian explaining to me about his grandpa made me feel less spooked. Some nights, I would be up playing a game on my PS5 or watching a show, and I would hear a noise. At this point, I just chuckle and say out loud, "Go to sleep, Grandpa. Everything's all good." I've been doing a lot of soul searching in my adult life. A lot of thinking about how things were when I was young. I don't talk about my childhood at all to anyone, because every time I think about it, I want to curl up into a ball and cry for hours on end. That's not a healthy way to live, though. So, I've been working on getting things off my chest and putting them out into the world to try to get closure. I know that things were trying for me when I was young. I know that I was raised in a household that wasn't loving. In fact, quite the opposite. And I know that none of it was my fault. I have to keep telling myself this as I work through my issues, something my therapist told me. I have to continue to tell myself that it wasn't my fault while I try to put things into perspective. So, I decided today that I would write this out and submit it to try to work through some things. The story isn't necessarily scary. It's more sad than anything, but I want to write it out and hopefully you can use it. And if not, that's fine too. I'm only going to write about one specific event in this story, and maybe I'll write about a few of the other things from before and after it eventually, but this was probably when things were the absolute worst for me as a child. I guess I should start by explaining a few things about my parents. My mother and father did not love me. They probably didn't even like me. They told me as much a few times that they didn't love me, and after the first few times I would cry, but the words started to mean less and less each time they said them. If my parents could have found the right buyer, they would have probably sold me for a baggie of some sort of illicit substance in a heartbeat. They were druggies, pretty much getting high anytime I wasn't in the house. I guess they respected me enough to not do it while I was there. But they were usually too far gone to even talk to by the time I got home from school. Our house was always a mess. My parents never had money to buy me new clothes, so growing up, I would have to wear things that were a size too small for me, or sometimes my aunt would drop off my older cousin's stuff that was a size too big. I always looked like such a clown, and I knew it, but thankfully some people could see through the situation and not judge me for it. They could judge my parents all they wanted. I didn't care. I had one friend, Matt, whose parents were really nice people. A bit strict, but they were friendly enough. I always felt safe at Matt's house, like nothing would happen to me. And I think that's why I grew so attached to them. So when they offered to pay for me to go to camp with Mark one summer, the summer I turned 9, it was a no-brainer. I didn't even bother asking my parents. I figured, what's the point? I just told them that I was staying with Matt for a few days. Neither of them acknowledged me as expected, and that was it. The camp was in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by trees and mountains, with a huge lake in the middle. This is probably my fondest memory growing up, those days where I got to feel normal around boys my age. I made a few new friends, spent time being a kid. We hiked, roasted marshmallows, stayed up late and told scary stories in the cabin. I didn't participate in the scary stories, though. I could have. I could have told him a few interesting ones, but I didn't. Matt and I even snuck out one night and went down to the lake, just watching the stars and talking about what we wanted to do when we grew up. Yes, I'm being nostalgic, because it's what I wanted to hold on to more than my home life back then. But, of course, the camp was only for a week. On the drive back, I remember feeling this tight knot in my stomach. Would my parents yell at me for being gone so long? I never told them where I was actually going, but would they really care? Also, could I do anything to make this last longer? When they pulled up to my house, it looked the same as always. Run down, unkempt, and dark. Matt's parents asked if my folks were home or if they needed to stick around and wait for them, but I lied and said that they were probably home. I told them that my dad worked nights, so they might have just been asleep, because it was the only thing I could think to use as a good excuse at 3 p.m. on a Friday afternoon for why my house looked like it had sat vacant for months. I waved goodbye to them as they pulled off, and pulled my backpack tighter, and headed up the front steps. I didn't look back. I didn't want Matt's parents to see me hesitate. I fumbled with my key, and when I stepped inside, the silence hit me like a wall. The house was empty. Completely empty. I remember standing in the entryway, just staring into the dark living room, hoping I would hear a TV on in the background, or the sound of my mom yelling at me for letting the flies in. But it was dead quiet. I don't know how long I stood there waiting for anything to happen, but eventually, I just tossed my bag and wandered into the kitchen to get something to eat. For some reason, I remember the fridge being full with a couple takeout containers, and an empty bottle of ketchup. I don't know why I remember the damn ketchup bottle, but I remember it sitting there on the center of the top shelf with no ketchup in it. I didn't panic, though. I was sort of used to my parents not really being there, even when they were. I figured they would show up sooner or later and yell at me for being home alone, which is something they had done before. Yes, they actually yelled at me and punished me for being home when they weren't there one time, even though they left me there. When I woke up the next morning, they still weren't home. The house was still empty. I ate some old cereal, no milk though, so I ended up eating it with water from the sink. I tried to keep myself busy with cleaning my room, drawing in my sketchbook, and just doing nothing. At least it being a Saturday, I did get to watch some cartoons, which I never got to do, so I had that going for me. That night was actually where things went, I guess, awry. I'm not really sure how to put it, but I'll explain. It was around 9 p.m. I was sitting in my bedroom with my lamp on, and I think I was drawing one of the Power Rangers mechs, when I heard the sound of glass breaking. I panicked for a moment, as any 9-year-old would, but it occurred to me that it was probably just my parents coming home and breaking something as they stumbled through the living room. I let out a sigh and headed down the stairs to greet them for whatever reason. When I got to the bottom, a man yelled at me to not move and pointed a gun at me. At that moment, I thought I was going to die. I remember immediately losing the air from my lungs and feeling like I was going to throw up. After a moment or two, it must have clicked for the guy that I was just a little kid, and he lowered the gun but kept staring at me. After a few seconds, he said something like, "Hey there, I'm not going to hurt you, just don't scream, okay?" I wanted to be brave, so I just responded with, "I'm not going to scream," trying to sound tough, I guess. He stepped up to where I was standing and asked if my parents were upstairs. And I told him no, that they weren't home. He stood there for a moment. I think he was trying to gauge whether or not I was lying. He told me to stay put and that he'd be right back. Then he went upstairs and searched from room to room. After he came back down, he asked me when they left, and I had to tell him that I honestly didn't know. He asked me a few questions about them, where they went, when I last saw them, etc. I think the more that I answered, the more this guy started to feel bad for me, because I could see in his eyes that he knew I was being honest. I had no idea where they were, when they left, all that. I told him that I went to summer camp for a week, and when I got home, they were gone and I hadn't seen them since. He asked me how old I was, and I told him honesty that I was 9. It was at this point that this guy pulled his mask off, and he just looked at me like I was the most pathetic thing he had ever seen. He looked like a pretty normal guy, nothing special, just long blonde hair, a little rough, and he seemed okay, despite the breaking and entering. This guy actually sat on the couch with me for a few moments, watching TV with me, and asking me about myself. At one point, I told him that I hadn't eaten anything but cereal since I got home, and he actually seemed shocked. He got up and went into the kitchen. I could hear him opening and closing the cabinets. When he came back into the living room, he looked like he was beyond upset with the situation, and actually asked me if I liked McDonald's. I told him that I loved McDonald's, and this was when the two of us, myself and the man that broke into my parents' house with a gun, looking for my deadbeat parents, took a short drive to the local McDonald's for chicken nuggets. We got back to my house, and he came in, this time through the door since I had a key, and we sat there eating McDonald's and watching whatever was on TV. It's a sad fact that this man that was probably looking to kill or rob my parents had acted more like a father in the couple hours I knew him than my real father. When we got done eating, he said that he had to get going, and I kid you not, I asked him if I could go with him. I think he would have said yes, if not for the whole criminal aspect of it. He said that I had to stay there, but that he would make sure I was okay, that nothing would happen to me. He then apologized to me for everything. I thanked him for the nuggets, and then he left. Surprisingly enough, he actually kept his promise, and he did make sure I was okay. I found out about 45 minutes later that he had called in an anonymous tip to the cops about a child being left alone for days. The cops showed up at the house, noticed the broken window, and when I answered and told them that my parents weren't home and that the window was broken because some man with a gun broke it, well, they took the whole thing pretty seriously. This was especially true when they found the drug paraphernalia in my parents' room. I've written a lot here, and I won't bore you with the legal aspect of all of what happened, but I do want to at least wrap this up by telling you why things went down this way. That man was, apparently, an enforcer for a big-name drug dealer in my town. My parents owed this drug dealer a lot of money, and he wanted to get paid. So he sent that man to get the money by any means necessary. Apparently, my parents somehow caught wind that they were going to get a visit from the dealer, so they took off. They packed up 2 bags, got in their car, and they headed west. At no point in time did they realize they were leaving me behind. I guess because I hadn't been there for a couple of days, though I'm not certain they would have taken me with them if I were even there. My parents were eventually located. They were in a drug house, both completely out of their minds on heroin. Apparently, my mother was, in simpler words, inches from death with how much she had injected. I was taken into custody by the state while they tried to figure out what to do with me. I will say that I never saw my father again after this event. He died in prison. I don't know, nor do I care how. I did see my mother after a few years, but it was only to tell her that I hated her for how she ruined my childhood. I ended up in the foster system, and thankfully, I did have a decent run there. better than most. I was put into an adoptive family that at least seemed like they cared, certainly more than my real parents. I know that this was long winded and, like I said, not scary, but it's my story, and I wanted to share it. If nothing else, it helps get it off my chest. So, thank you, Raven, for allowing me to do so. And if you use this story, thank you for that as well. I wanted to send in a story that most probably won't find creepy, and maybe there's some kind of logical explanation, but for me, at the time, it was really strange. Maybe that's more what this story would be. A strange story instead of a scary one. I don't know. I'll let you decide how to use it if you choose to. This happened back in the summer when I was 11 years old. I don't remember much about the summer, honestly, but I do remember this specific day. It was summer break. I was at home, an only child, and both of my parents worked. So I spent a lot of time by myself. This was one of those days where I was home alone doing whatever I did at the age of 11. It was hot, but I also remember that it was really rainy. Like we were getting hit with a crazy storm. I wasn't able to go outside to do anything because of how much it was coming down, and the street was starting to basically become a small stream. After about half an hour of the rain coming down, it started getting really windy, and at one point the power went out. I was pretty upset about that, because I was playing Pokemon Stadium on my N64, and I was in the middle of one of the cup tournaments, and then the power went out. If I were any more angsty, I probably would have thrown my controller in a rage, but I also didn't want to break my stuff, so I just put it down and yelled at the now dark TV. I went downstairs and decided to just sit on the couch and do nothing until we got the power back, because I wasn't sure what else I could do. I sat there and watched the rain come down, thinking about how quiet it was, when out of nowhere I heard a familiar tune. It was the tone that came from an ice cream truck. I guess I should mention a couple of things about my neighborhood. I lived on a cul-de-sac, so one way in and one way out. We did have an ice cream truck that came through, but they usually came through on Tuesdays and Fridays, and I don't believe that this was either of those. On top of that, the truck that did come through would come through at 3 in the afternoon. They never came through earlier in the day. I know it seems weird that I knew the exact time, but I remember weird things like that. That's just how I've always been. At first I thought I was imagining it. There was no way that an ice cream truck was riding around in the rain like that, but as it was getting close, it was getting louder, so it was definitely real. But again, in the middle of a massive thunderstorm, no one is going to be running out to get their ice cream. I wiped the condensation off the window just to watch as this colorful van drove down the road and around part of the cul-de-sac. I watched as it kept going, the tires sloshing through the collecting water, and the headlights barely visible. But sure enough, the van was covered in colorful decals, with various ice cream treats plastered all over it. I remember feeling really strange as I watched the van pull around, and then just kind of stop. It pulled just past my house in the middle of the circle, and it stopped. I sat there and watched the van sitting there on the road, the music continuing to play at max volume. It was kind of unsettling. The background of the thunderstorm with this van just sitting there, motionless, and chiming out whatever soulless kid tune it was playing. No one got out of the truck. No one walked out of any of the houses toward the van or anything. There was no one outside anywhere. Just this van sitting on the street, headlights shining, windshield wipers going, and music playing. Now, logically, one could assume that this van was maybe just pulling over to wait out the worst of the storm. And that would make sense, right? But then why would he, one, drive in the storm for several minutes to come down this specific cul-de-sac, and then why would he park there and keep the music playing? Normally, the van would play the music while he approached, and then it would be off when he stopped. But this guy didn't turn it off. It just kept playing, over and over, on a loop, for an hour. At least an hour. I watched this truck over the time, glancing over every few moments to see if he moved or anyone got out, but no. This guy seriously just stopped and was taunting 11-year-old me with this annoying, slightly distorted song. Obviously, I don't think it was actually about me, but who knows, right? I wasn't able to think about anything but the dumb song. It was super distracting and super loud. At one point, I thought about going outside to see if maybe the guy needed help or something, but I didn't. I was way too shy to do something like that. After that hour or so, the van slowly crept away from where it was parked, and then left. As suddenly as it appeared, it was gone. It was super slow as it rolled down the road, like 5 miles per hour, and the music kept going as it left the area. I watched it turn to the right and go out of view. I have no idea what the hell this was. And like I said, a lot of people may not think that this was scary, but I cannot think of any reason for this guy to have just sat there for that long with the music going like that. Like maybe he was waiting for someone in the neighborhood, but then why wait for a full hour like that? Why keep the music going? Plus, no one came out. No one exited the van. The whole waiting out the storm thing kind of makes sense, minus the fact that the storm was still going when he left. And again, the music. Maybe he was being a nuisance. Sure, that makes sense, but then again, why? I just don't know. Worse yet, I never saw that ice cream van again for the rest of the summer. Or honestly ever. We had our regular one that came back the next week, but that specific one never returned. I told my mom about it when she got home, and her only explanation was that maybe he didn't know the music was on. Which I cannot personally believe, with how loud and obnoxious it was. Looking back, it was very strange. And for some paranoid reason, part of me tells me that he wasn't there to sell ice cream. What he was there for, however, I will likely never know. When I was around 9, I had this stuffed penguin. It wasn't one of those cute, soft, and fluffy ones you see everywhere, no. This thing was almost as tall as I was at the time. This thing was big, over 3 feet tall, with glossy black eyes, and a strange, almost rigid body. My uncle had given it to me for my birthday a couple of years prior, and I remember the minute that I saw it, I hated it. There was something off about it. Something that made me feel uneasy. Like it was watching me when I wasn't paying attention. I loved my uncle. He was a great guy, and he meant well, but I have no idea why he bought that thing. I was polite about it, and he was excited to see me with this giant stuffed bird, so I smiled and said thanks. It ended up in my room, of course, perched in the corner near my bed, and as much as I tried to ignore it, I would lie there every night convinced that it was watching me. Eventually, I asked my mom if we could move it somewhere else in the house, and she finally agreed. saying that we could move it into the spare bedroom, which was right across the hall from my room. It was far enough, though, and I was just happy that it was out of my room whatsoever. That's the setup to the story. I promise, it is going somewhere. It was a year later, when I was 10, and I had my friend Evan staying the night. It was late summer and a big storm had rolled in. It was a cooler night though, so my mom wanted to keep the windows cracked in the living room so we wouldn't have to run the AC. It was one of those summer storms where everything was going crazy. The wind was hitting the house, the trees were smacking the windows. Basically, it was going to be one of those nights where Evan and I tried to scare the crap out of each other. We were telling each other creepy ghost stories in my room after everyone had gone to bed, just trying to make up anything and everything we could that would be scary, which wasn't much since we were 10 years old. I had just finished telling a story that I made up or read about in a book or something about a clown that would watch kids sleep through the window, when out of nowhere, Evan asked me if I still had that creepy, giant penguin thing. Evan, being my best friend, knew that thing scared the hell out of me, so of course he would bring it up. I hadn't thought about it in a while, but the second he mentioned it, I started thinking about it again, and I got that chill down my spine. I tried to sound calm and say, "Oh, yeah, it's in the spare room now. I didn't want it in my room anymore." Evan then said, "We should go check it out." I immediately tried to say no, that I wasn't supposed to leave my room after bedtime like that, which was a total lie, and I'm sure Evan knew it. But Evan kept pushing me, saying that I was a baby, and that I was letting a stuffed penguin scare me. I relented because I wasn't going to let him think that. I grabbed my flashlight, and we opened my door and slightly down the hall to go to the door to the spare bedroom. I stood there for a moment just thinking about that stupid penguin. Evan pushed in front of me and grabbed the door, pushing it open for me, basically giving me no alternative. I stepped into the room behind him and shined the flashlight back and forth, looking for the penguin. Of course, it was there, in the corner, just lying there face down on the spare bed. Evan laughed at me, saying that it was a stupid thing that I was so scared of a stuffed penguin. I gave a slight chuckle and agreed with him, just saying, "Yeah, it's just a dumb toy." This is where things went weird. When I said that, I swear to you that the room dropped a solid 10 degrees. It went from slightly cooler to freezing in there in an instant. I turned back toward Evan to ask if he was cold too, and the door behind him started creaking, and then shut, hard, like someone had pushed it. It wasn't me. I was standing there staring at Evan, and I knew it wasn't him, because I was literally looking right at him. I stared at the door with my mouth slightly open, just freaking out, when Evan hit me on the shoulder and told me to look, pointing in the direction of the bed. When I turned that way and shined the light on the bed, I saw the penguin. Only this time, it wasn't lying flat. It was standing up and leaning against the back corner of the bed. That was more than enough for me. I ran from where I was standing to the door and yanked it open, running as fast as I could across the hallway back to my bedroom. Evan yelled out for me to not leave him there and stumbled out of the room towards mine. When we got back to my room, I flicked on the light and was surprised to see that Evan actually had tears on his face. I asked if he was okay, and he told me that he was fine, and then wiped them away, and asked what was wrong with that stupid penguin. I said that I hated that damn thing, that it was always creepy to me, and I hated having it in my room, and that's why it was over in there. And now I had even more reason to hate it. It was such a quick event, but it was probably the most terrifying thing I had ever experienced as a child. Neither of us spoke about it after that, And I didn't go back into that spare bedroom at all. Like, ever. My mom still lives in that house, and to this day, I still refuse to go in there, even though that penguin is long gone. I personally think that the penguin was cursed, or haunted, or had something attached to it. I don't know. That was the only time I ever had a paranormal experience. And it didn't start until I called the thing stupid. I actually asked my uncle where he got it, but he honestly could not remember. He knew that he didn't buy it from a big store or anything, but he couldn't recall where exactly it had come from. I don't know, and now I don't really care. I'm just glad that I never had a run-in with whatever it was that was attached to that stupid penguin ever again. Hello, Raven. I'm a big fan of you and love your podcast. I have severe insomnia, so at night I listen to your stories to help me sleep. Thank you. At the time of this story, I was 3 years old, so some details might be a little off. I lived in the ghetto of an already sketchy town that I lived in. I lived in a townhome that was tiny and the walls were paper thin. Keep this in mind as it is important later. I was in preschool but had stayed home that day as I was sick. So it was only myself and my mom. There was a drug dealer that lived across the street from me, and so the police got suspicious of this man and decided to go ask questions. The cops knocked on the door of that man's house, and immediately the drug dealer ran out the door with a gun. So the cop also got his gun. If they fired off, my house or the neighbor, who we'll call Z, would have gotten hit. Of course, being the stupid 3-year-old that I was, I had ran to the window to see what was happening. My mom ran and had to hold me to the floor to guarantee that I wouldn't get shot. My mom called Z to let her know of the dangers. And through the paper-thin walls, I heard Z yell to someone, "Get down!" So the cop and the dealer were holding their guns right at each other. But then the dealer ran in his house and stayed there, firing his gun into the house to try to make them think that he had shot himself. Of course, this made the cop call for backup. I distinctly recall seeing 11 police cars show up and a SWAT team. They were yelling through the door for him to open it. No answer. This continued for about 5 minutes. Still no answer, so the SWAT team did their movie scene. The battering ram shook the whole neighborhood. Their raid lasted for 20 minutes as the SWAT and dealers played the game of hide and seek. And finally they got him, and they were pointing the big guns at him as they shoved him into the police car. I'm glad that no shots were fired in this duel, and I know this probably wasn't too scary, but it is the scariest thing to happen to me. Thanks again, Raven. Lots of love. I wanted to share an experience I had when I lived in one of my first apartments in my 20s. It was a nice little complex, and for the most part, everyone around me either kept to themselves or were at least nice enough to have a passing conversation with you. All but one of those neighbors, who I will refer to as Tom. Tom lived in the apartment directly below me. He was an older gentleman, maybe in his late 60s, I'd guess. At first, he seemed to keep to himself. I would typically see him sitting out on his balcony, smoking and reading a book. We never really conversed, unless we were at the mailbox at the same time. And I mean, that was it. He was typically on that little balcony, but then things started getting weird, and we started running into each other more. Coincidence? It began with him staring. I would come home from work, and he'd be sitting on his balcony that faced the main walkway. He would have his book on him, but as soon as he spotted me, he would put it down and watch me, his eyes following me all the way to the door. I brush it off as just an old man watching over the complex, maybe in a weird neighborhood watch kind of way. But then, as this continued to happen, it seemed more focused on me, like he was watching me specifically. I would watch the family enter as I pulled up, and he would glance at them for a moment and then go back to his book. But as soon as I stepped out of the car, his attention was on me, all the way. A few weeks into these occurrences, I started finding notes. There were post-its left on my door, slipped into my mailbox, or even under my door. They were never signed, so at first I had no idea who it was. The first one on my door just mentioned something about having a good day. I assumed that someone was just trying to be nice, and I remember putting it on my fridge. But then the other notes became a bit more unsettling, in my opinion. Some would be making a comment on how I looked that day, suggestions on dinner after seeing my groceries, or there was even one that said I looked tired and that I needed to rest. Those seemed to be a bit more targeted. They weren't threatening, but the fact that they made a comment about seeing the cans in my grocery bag or how I looked was definitely alarming. Now, I didn't at the time, nor have I ever gotten proof that it was Tom. But he was the only person I noticed that day when I brought home those canned tomatoes. Whoever it was like they were this constant judgmental observer of my life, and it almost had me paranoid. Then, the direct communication began with Tom. I had come home late from work one night, so no one was out. Tom wasn't even out on his balcony. I entered the complex, and as I headed up the stairs, I heard my name being whispered. I stopped and looked around to see Tom, standing at his door with it slightly cracked open. Did he really just say my name? And how did he even know it? I hesitantly walked closer to the door. I was suspicious that he was leaving me the notes at this point. He held out his hand out of his door and said, "You dropped this," as he held out my white and red striped scarf. I hadn't even realized it was missing. When was the last time that I wore it? At this time, it was getting chilly, so I had started wearing my scarves, but I didn't remember ever losing it. I didn't often take my scarves off during the day until I was home. I slowly took the scarf and thanked him. He tried to smile, but it looked way too forced, and he shut the door. What an odd interaction. But I took my scarf back inside, checked my hanger, and realized it had to be mine as it was missing, but how? After that, I started to feel a bit more suspicious. I had no idea how he had my scarf, but what could I do? I just stopped delaying on my way to my apartment. I made sure I had everything as I left or came home and always locked my door and deadbolt behind me. But then, one day when I came home and walked up the stairs, I saw Tom in front of my door looking down at his hands. I stopped at the top of the stairs and said, "Can I help you?" I could see his slight jump as I startled him, and he slowly turned around, holding a key ring out to me with 2 keys on it. He held out the keys to me and again said, "I found these. I think they're yours." I grabbed them and looked at them. He said they were outside by my car, so he assumed they were mine. I again thanked him, probably looking at him suspicious, I'm sure. Once I heard his door close, I tried the keys that he gave me, and to my surprise, they worked on my door. Well, one of them did. The other one was smaller and kind of looked like a mailbox key. But here's the thing. I still had both of my keys. I even compared the smaller mailbox key and it was a match. How the hell did he get a copy of my key? From then on, I kept a close eye on my stuff. And Tom. I kept my purse with my keys in my bedroom. I tried my best to keep track of any mail I got, and in fact, changed my address back to my parents' place until I felt comfortable with changing it back. I started getting some of my groceries delivered so I didn't have to leave. It seems paranoid, but at the same time, he had to have gotten my scarf and copies of my keys somehow. Then, it all came to a head for me. They were going to be repaving the parking lot of my apartment complex, so I had to park further away, in an area that I wouldn't normally park. I was also not feeling well, so I took the day off, camping out on my couch with tea and Dayquil. While sitting there, watching TV, I heard the familiar sound of keys jingling. Normally, I would assume it was someone leaving or entering their apartment. But then, my doorknob jiggled. It couldn't have been maintenance because they had to give 24 hours notice. Was someone really trying to break into my place? I jumped off the couch and went to my door and slowly looked through the peephole. And, to my horror, Tom was on the other side, looking down at the knob. He must have been trying to unlock the door. I just froze, not knowing what to do. Do I open the door and startle him? But I worried that he would hear me unlock the deadbolts and take off. But what would happen if he opened the door and saw me inside? After a few seconds, I heard the deadbolt unlatch. I ran to my phone and called 911, and by the time I was speaking to the operator, Tom had opened the door. I immediately yelled at him, "What the hell are you doing, Tom?" And he just said that he was returning some mail that he got in his box. He slowly put it on the shelf next to the door as if it was a totally normal thing to do, to enter someone's apartment, and then backed up and left. The operator was asking me what was happening, and after he left, I ran back to the door locking it, like that was going to do something. I told the operator what happened, and even unloaded on her about the notes, the keys, everything. I sat at the door until the police arrived, and explained everything to them too. They went to his apartment, and they asked him about it, and he admitted to having the keys, and again just claimed that he found them. We even got the office involved, and they confirmed that they still had their copies of my keys too. So how the hell did he get them? The office told the police that the ones Tom had, and the ones he gave to me had to be copies, because they only had the 2 pairs, and they were changed after someone moved out. I was able to file a restraining order on him, and thankfully, the office also agreed to let me move to another complex. It was a pain, but at least I was away from Tom. It actually came out that this wasn't the first time Tom had done something like this to other young women. Looking at his public record, after getting his last name and info from the restraining order, he had multiple reports for stalking and harassment. I was angry that he even lived in the complex at all, but I didn't know what all the rental offices could see or use. At least they were willing to let me move, and they did take it seriously. That was probably one of the creepiest things to ever happen to me. I don't live there now, but I really do worry about others that have to live near him. I don't know if he ended up leaving or getting kicked out, but hopefully they were at least smart enough to not put another female in that complex. Because what if I didn't call the cops? What if I had been asleep inside? I don't even want to think about what could have happened, and I'm just thankful I was able to catch him in the act and do something about it. Hey, Raven. Thanks for putting me to sleep. I mean that in the best possible way. My day is made every time I see a new upload, and I try to save them for bedtime, but sometimes the instant gratification monkey in my brain won't allow it, and I devour the episode immediately upon noticing it. Thank you. Addict tendencies aside, here's my story. I grew up in a not-so-functional family. My parents both struggled with addiction, and our family dynamics were strange, although I wouldn't recognize that they weren't normal until I was older. My dad lost his ability to work due to a disabling injury when I was pretty young, so he and my mom ended up staying home rather than working. My mom had always been a better homes and gardens type of mom up until the time of my dad's accident, but lost her ability to keep that whenever he began staying home full time. He wouldn't allow her to work or even leave the house that often. So, aside from us going to school, we were a fairly reclusive family. The house that we lived in was large and old with its fair share of problems. My parents bought it while my dad was still working and got it at a great price, since the cosmetic facelift didn't fix any of the major issues with the place. Weird things would occasionally happen, like seeing shadow figures or hearing odd noises, some of which we contributed to the rat infestation that had taken over most of the homes in the area. However, some things we couldn't overlook. It always felt like you were being watched, like something dark was looming. I was terrified to get up in the middle of the night and would often run to and from the bathroom only to return to my room and hide under the covers. As time went on, both parents fell deeper into addiction. There was more fighting, more strange occurrences, and the constant presence of overwhelming tension. My dad attempted to take his own life on multiple occasions, something I didn't know until later on. He was in a lot of physical pain, paired with mental instability and a struggle with drug use. One evening, we were all home when he chose to end his life in front of us. I was devastated at first. Of course I was. I was a kid, and the uncertainty of life without one of my parents was more than I could process. Although, as days went on, there was a tremendous reduction in the heavy pressure of our home. As cold-hearted as it may sound, we were experiencing relief for the first time in a long time. My father had been an abusive man. He often spoke of situations that would lead him to become a family annihilator. By his logic, he would rather us die by his doing than by chance. With him gone, the only fear was the fear of uncertainty. While this was an improvement, the paranormal activity reached an all-time high. My mom heard my dad talking to her one night when no one was in the room with her. One morning, we woke up to find a large rectangle cut into the carpet. This was a perfect rectangle. It looked like someone had used a sharp razor to do this. No one had been in our home but my younger sibling, myself, and my mom. One more incident during this same string of events that stands out is the warning. My mom had gone into a room that was rarely opened to do something. Inside, she discovered something that made us all sick to our stomachs. Remember those silicone bracelets with the messages on them that you would get at a school or events? One of us had brought one home after a fire safety presentation and put it in a toy box somewhere because we thought it was too cool to lose. It was a glow-in-the-dark bracelet that said something along the lines of, "When fire strikes, get out and stay out." Well, this bracelet had been stored away for most likely a couple of years at this point, and it had a section cleanly cut from it and left in the middle of the floor in the room. The section of the bracelet that was setting face up for my mom to find said, "Get out." We never found the rest of the bracelet, or found out how this got here. Was this a warning? A threat? A coincidence? If this alone had happened, maybe we could consider it a weird fluke. Unfortunately, paranormal events had become a daily ordeal. We had the house cleansed by several religious figures on different occasions. Things would get a little less active for a bit before picking up again. There was one room you would go in and you would feel like someone was watching you, regardless of the time of day or whether you were alone or not. We frequently experienced a burning sensation in our skin while in this room. We went from seeing shadow figures to decently formed apparitions. A couple of times, these apparitions didn't seem to have ill intent. 95% of the time, whatever these things were seemed to be there to scare us. This house and these events are well behind us now, but we still wonder about the cause of the things that we experienced there. The house is long gone as we knew it, so hopefully no families will experience what we went through there. This is my first time submitting a story, so thank you for reading, and maybe someone else has gone through something similar. This story is the absolute truth. I was about 5 when I saw it for the first time. The first neighborhood I lived in had a small ditch to it. They were digging it up for God knows what, but it was fun to play in. One night, it was a little darker than usual. I was getting ready to head home when I came across a human bone. The innocent 5-year-old me thought that it was a dinosaur bone, because it had been sticking out of the ground. Thinking back to later on, I realized that I almost touched a human femur. I think I mentioned this because it just didn't seem right. But anyway, that night I had a nightmare of something running by the edge of the highway in our canyon. It was keeping up with the car I was in, and then eventually stopped and looked at me and smiled. It was almost human, but it was paler and seemed iridescent. The image of this person scared me so bad that I woke up in a cold sweat. I looked outside thinking I would see her, but I didn't, luckily. Oh yes, this figure did look female. There was just something about her that extremely put me off. But as a 5-year-old, I moved on pretty quickly. And then the next time I saw her wasn't until I was 10. I was going through the canyon with my friends on the way back, when one of the girls tells me to look out the window. I think I started tearing up when I saw it, this thing. Whatever it was could harm me so easily. And then it played the same dream sequence. It stopped right before a bridge, and this time I saw her full face. Her smile was wicked and full of anger. Her eyes were black, teeth were crooked. She looked almost as if she had been a pioneer woman that had been wronged. I couldn't bear it much longer, and then she vanished. She showed up again when my mom opened her shop. For a bit of background, our town was big on smuggling in its early development, so they created a tunnel system from the train station to my high school. My mom's bakery was formerly a hotel, where 3 kids went missing, a man was murdered, and a couple other things. But it was just a place where ghosts felt welcome. My parents were very ignorant to them, but I felt them every time I went in the basement. I spent most of my time in the basement because it was so interesting for me. Of course, a 13-year-old me was trying to understand the other side. I never felt unsafe or in danger until one day when I was messing around with my brother's friend. We had turned off all the lights and used just my flashlight on my phone. Each room of the basement had a different vibe, the back room being the most confusing. When we had reached the back room, I turned my flashlight to him. Behind his shadow there was a woman's figure, dark, but you could tell it was there. He saw the fear in my eyes, and we both darted for the stairs. For some reason, I could tell that it was her. I know it wanted to hurt me. If I had stayed any longer, it would have grabbed both of us. Flash forward to last year, I'm 14, turning 15, and me, my boyfriend, and his parents had gone out to the countryside to go stargazing. There was this parking lot, surrounded by trees, and that was where we stopped. When it became dark, I looked out into the woods. I felt her presence again. She wasn't coming for me, but I knew that she was there and she was frustrated. I don't know how I knew, but I knew. I shrugged it off, but this feeling became stronger, like she was closer. Just as it was time to leave, I looked in a direction that I hadn't seen before and felt like I saw her, just on the edge of the trees. I wasn't sure of this last time, because she didn't form the way she usually did. I know this isn't the last of her, but that's all that I can share for now, so thanks, Raven. Hey, Raven. I heard you were looking for creepy neighbor stories, and trust me, I've got one. This happened when I was about 22 or 23, after my partner and I moved into our first apartment together. We were so excited. It was our first place, our own little home, and we were ready to start this new chapter in our lives. But soon enough, the excitement faded because of him. Our neighbor. He was old, probably in his 70s, with these piercing blue eyes that just stared. And he was always there. At first it seemed innocent, like maybe he was just a lonely old man, but that feeling changed quickly. One day I was outside hanging up my washing, bras and G-string, thongs I think you guys call them, and there he was again. This time, though, it wasn't just his usual stare. He had this smirk, like he was enjoying the sight. I tried to ignore him, but he said, "Nice weather for, delicates." It wasn't the words, it was how he said it. It felt dirty. He licked his lips and walked off, moaning. Yes, that kind of moan. From that moment, I stopped hanging my underwear outside. I couldn't bring myself to do it again. I didn't want to give him another reason to look at me like that. But that didn't stop him. I would go out to check the mail, and there he would be, just standing there, too close for comfort. One time, as I grabbed the letters from the mailbox, he muttered something under his breath, smirking again. He asked me to pick up his mail that he had dropped. On purpose, I'm sure, just to watch me bend over. Then, as I handed him his mail, he said, "I could see you from my window, you know." It was like he wanted me to know that he was watching, even when I thought I was alone. After that, it wasn't just a coincidence. He knew my routine. He would appear when I was heading to the car, and once, as I rushed past, he said, "Off somewhere? I hope you're coming back." The way he said it made my skin crawl, like he wasn't sure if I would come back, or he had done something to my car. At night, I started hearing noises, footsteps, outside my door. They were slow, deliberate, as if someone was right on the other side, just waiting. I checked the peephole, but no one would be there, and then the next morning I would see him again, lingering near my door. One time, he looked at me and said, "Sometimes I think about visiting you. It gets lonely, you know?" My heart raced. What did he mean by that? Was he the one at my door at night? I started avoiding him, changing my routine and making sure that we wouldn't cross paths. But somehow he was always there, waiting. It got to the point where I couldn't even relax in my own apartment. Every creak, every sound made me wonder if he had somehow gotten inside. Sometimes I would come home and swear the door that I had locked was slightly ajar. Was I imagining it, or had he been in there? I told my partner, but he didn't seem to get it. To him, he was just a weird old man. But to me, he was more than that. He was everywhere, always watching me. And one day, I came home late, and as I walked past his window, I saw him standing there staring out at me with that same smirk on his face. It felt like a warning, like he knew I couldn't escape his eyes no matter what I did. We moved out after that. as I just didn't want to stay there any longer as I didn't feel safe. Even now, I can't shake that feeling that he was planning something, that he wanted to do something more than just watch. I never found out for sure, but sometimes I still wonder, was I safe? Or did I narrowly avoid something much, much worse? Hey Raven, this happened to me when I was a kid, about 7 years old. In 1983, around the first week of school in early September, I had been outside playing with a baseball and throwing it around when it went into the road and started rolling down the street in between cars. I chased it for a bit before running in front of a car and having the car lock the brakes up, almost hitting me. Scared, I gave up chasing it and ran back to my house as quickly as possible. As I arrived back to the house, I hear a voice calling my name from behind me, and there stood the mom of a friend who lived up the road holding my ball. I remember grabbing the ball from her and going inside the house to tell my mom what just happened. This is where it gets strange. This was 1983, and the mom who had just handed me the ball had been out of the country and on a flight. My mom knew this because my friend up the street was being watched by the grandparents while his mom was away. That night on the news, we find out that a plane, Korean Airlines Flight 007, was shot down, and all the passengers on the plane were killed. My friend up the street, his mom was on that plane. I'm trying to make sense of this even years later, as I know that it was my mom's friend who handed me that ball after I ran out in front of a car. I still remember the image of her standing at the end of my driveway and calling my name, holding my ball, but how could it have been her if she had died in a plane crash that day? I'm 48 years old now, and I still remember all this like it was yesterday. When I was a kid, maybe 8, my next door neighbor, who we'll call Abby for privacy reasons, was about 6 or 7. We would spend hours on the weekends and summers playing in her front yard. Abby was allowed to watch horror and crime movies, and I was not. She had watched The Lovely Bones and gave me a childlike synopsis of it. We would play pretend and act like there were bodies buried from serial killers, kidnappers, and overall bad people. One day I got this idea in my head that the other neighbor beside us was a creep, so I told Abby this, and she agreed with me. We would spend countless hours playing true crime pretend, until one day in early November, me and Abby were outside spending time on her front porch, when someone called Abby's name. We looked over the fence, and there was the man who lived beside us. He was holding 2 bags of candy in Ziploc bags. He went on to tell us that he noticed we didn't stop for candy on Halloween, so he wanted to give us some. I'd been told my whole life not to take things from strangers, so I didn't. But Abby, on the other hand, went to the fence and grabbed the candy. She came back and popped a piece into her mouth. Me, being the paranoid kid that I was, went inside and told her grandma. Abby's grandma told us that we were okay, told Abby not to take candy from strangers, and she threw away the candy. Then we didn't hear another word about it. Fast forward 15 years later, the other day I told my mom about this story and she looked at me wide-eyed. No one had told her this story, which is a red flag. But anyways, apparently when we first moved into the house, Abby's grandmother was very, very adamant that the neighbor was a creep, and that we needed to stay away from him at all times. So, that's the story of how I, a sheltered kid, made up this imaginary theory about a neighbor that turned out to have some actual merit. This happened back whenever I was in my early 20s in 2010. I was a dumb kid doing dumb things, and there was one time when I was driving to my girlfriend's place, for reasons, that something happened that was seriously terrifying. Like, potentially life-threatening levels of terrifying. My girlfriend lived in the town over, so I had to take the highway to her place. About a 15-minute drive on a good day. On this specific day, I had made plans to head over to her place, not even thinking about the fact that we were supposed to get a decent storm when I was going to be leaving. It was one of those storms that you knew was going to hit based on how dark the clouds were off on the horizon, and I was going to be heading straight into it. It started fine, with just a light drizzle, but within minutes, it pretty much turned into a torrential downpour. That wouldn't be an issue for normal people, but my windshield wipers were barely functional. There was something wrong with the wiper motor, and they would move really slow, or sometimes they would go up and just get stuck. And then I would have to reach out to push them back down. I was pretty pissed off at myself. I'd had the money to get it fixed, and I'd had the time, but for some dumb reason I just didn't. Probably laziness. I spotted a bridge a bit up the way, and I decided that I would pull over onto the shoulder. I'd be out of the worst of the rain, and I could wait it out for a bit. My old car rattled as I steered it off the road and parked just beneath the overpass. The windshield was finally clear of rain, but the whole car was shaking slightly from the wind and the roar of passing traffic. I sat there for a bit, just listening to the rain falling, trying to get a text out to my girlfriend to let her know that I would be a bit late. The storm looked like it was going to stay for a little while, and I started debating whether or not I should give it a second go. When out of nowhere, bang. The sound was so loud and sudden that I jumped in my seat. For a second, I thought lightning had struck nearby, but this noise was different. Closer. More like metal hitting metal. My heart was pounding and I looked around, trying to figure out what had just happened. A car had passed me just as the noise went off, and my first thought was maybe they'd blown a tire. The sound had that kind of punch to it. I turned off the car and opened my door to step out, thinking I would see the car pull over with a flat a little ways down the road or something. But there wasn't anything out of place, or anyone else pulling over. Then I turned back to my car and saw it. Right there, on the lower part of my door, was a small, clean hole. It was a bullet hole. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at it. My brain was struggling to process what I was looking at. A bullet? Someone had fired a gun and it had hit my car. It was small, just about the size of a dime, but it was deep. The metal around it was dented. The realization hit me like a punch in the gut. If the bullet had gone through the door, it would have gone right into my leg. My ankle, to be exact. I stood up, and I scanned the highway looking for... what? The shooter? Another car pulled over? I really didn't know. It was just rain and blurry headlights zooming by. Nothing out of the ordinary. I scrambled back into my car, slamming the door shut. My mind was racing. Was someone out there taking random shots at cars in the storm? Was it just an accident? A stray bullet from somewhere else? I had no idea, but I knew I needed to call 911. The dispatcher kept me on the line while I waited for the police to arrive. I tried to explain what happened, but even as I was saying it out loud, it felt unreal. I was just sitting here, waiting for the storm to pass, and a bullet hit my car, I told her. She was calm, probably more calm than I was, and assured me that someone was on the way. I waited for the officers, and when they finally pulled up with their lights on, A tall guy with a calm demeanor knocked on my window and asked if I was okay. I nodded and told him that I personally wasn't hit, but he could very well see the hole in my door. We talked about it for a while. He told me that I was lucky the round didn't go all the way through, by literally just some miracle. There really wasn't any reason for it to not have done so. It was just luck, I guess. Another officer drove around, checked the area, and looked for literally anything. There weren't any clues for what exactly happened, but they took my info and told me that they were just glad I wasn't hit. They ended up driving off, and I sat there for a few more moments, thinking about life and how fragile it can be. Poetic, I know, but if whoever had pulled that trigger had been aiming higher, that round very well could have just gone through my window, my chest, or my neck, and made those moments my last. Hi, Raven. Greetings from the UK. I've been umming and ahhing about submitting this, but I was talking to a friend about it when it happened recently, and they said that I should share the full thing, so here we go. For pretty much all of my life, I've been able to hear things that aren't there and sort of modify things that have happened. Nothing on a huge scale, just tiny things like I cracked my husband's favorite glass. Didn't want to admit it, so I just popped it back into the cupboard and imagined it being used and unbroken. And then he used it the next day and there was no crack. It was fine. I had a set of work keys in my pocket, and as I pulled my phone out of my pocket, what sounded like and felt like the keys came to, and I heard them and saw them just as they slipped down the drain in the street. I imagined them in the center console of my car. I hadn't even been in my car since having the keys on me, and then later that day, when I got in my car, in the center console were the keys. These are just a couple of examples, and when I lost the keys, I had a work friend with me who, when I showed her that I had found the keys in my car, was obviously super confused. I explained how these things happen fairly regularly, and she suggested I tell my story to you. As I say, this does happen fairly regularly, and is unintentional, so if I try to actively imagine a scenario, it doesn't come to pass. But when the image sort of pops into my head, then generally it does. Now, I'm not sure if this is connected, but I also hear a voice sometimes. I know this is why maybe I'm just balmy. The voice is like a hoarse whisper, and it really creeps me out. I was hoovering the stairs once, and I clearly heard the voice in my ear say my name. It scared me, so I turned off the hoover and all was silent for a couple of seconds until my phone started ringing downstairs, which I wouldn't have heard had the hoover been on. It was a phone call from my husband who had been on a tour, military, and had no access to a phone regularly. He could only call me from a satellite phone at random times. This was the first time I had spoken to him in over a week. The other week, I heard it say rainbow, like a murmur. Later on, I went to check on the kids, and their fairy lights in their rooms were flashing multicolored. We only ever keep them on a timer, and on static, warm white. The kids are scared of the dark. I logically thought the kids must have been playing with the lights, not that they ever have before, but it's the only logical explanation. But when I tried to change the lights back to white, there were no batteries in the remote. We had taken them out to use in one of the kids' toys a week before. The most memorable time I heard the voice was the 7th of July of 2005. I was at Aldgate Station, going to surprise my husband at his barracks. This was before we were married. It was around 8:30 in the morning when I heard the voice say, "Boo," in a creepy whisper. It scared me, but I thought maybe it was just the sounds of the station. I decided I needed to call my husband to let him know I was coming, so I went out to call him. He turned out not to be at the barracks and was at my flat. I walked home. Just look up the date and the station. Maybe if the voice didn't say boo, I would have been either on a train or at the station when the London bombings took place. I was very, very lucky. A few years ago, we went on a walk around some castle grounds, and my daughter wanted to chase the geese. I was telling her not to because they might fly at my son who was in a pushchair, and as I was telling her not to, I heard the voice say, "Go on then." I ignored it, but within 15 minutes, a goose flew at me whilst I was pushing the pram, and cut my cheek. I managed to catch the voice on video whilst I was telling my daughter to not chase them. I could send the video if you would like to hear it. I forgot to mention that because of the goose flying at me, both of my children were screaming fits, and I decided it was time to go home. Not stop and stay another hour for lunch. Just after lunchtime, when we would have been driving home, there was a huge car crash and a traffic jam that lasted for hours, which we would have ended up in had we not left early. I also often hear boots walking about upstairs. We live in a 300-year-old coach house which is detached, but there's no one home. Constant clicking noises, which sound like the light switches being turned on or off. Never any changes to the lights, though, and it often sounds like someone is walking up and down our hallway. It always gives me an uneasy, uncomfortable feeling. So, am I haunted? Do I have a guardian angel? Some kind of superpowers? I don't know. I know that what I hear scares me and doesn't give me a good vibe, but the things that happen are usually to my benefit in some way. I would love to hear your thoughts, and thanks for reading. Your request for creepy neighbor stories prompted me to remember this. This took place probably about 2 decades ago. I grew up in the country and we did not have any neighbors within a few miles of us my entire childhood. When I was a teenager, a man named Mr. Bogner moved about a quarter-mile away. He retired and moved down from several states up north to my home state. He had a double-wide put on a piece of land near the river. He lived alone, and we did not see him much. At some point, my dad met and introduced himself, but he mostly stayed to himself. He didn't seem to have any family or visitors. Occasionally, myself or my siblings would go on walks about a half-mile to the river and back home. One summer evening, my sister and her friend, who were about 13, went for a walk. As they walked past his driveway, they noticed his mailbox was open. They walked over towards it to close it, and saw that it was packed. One of them looked at a piece of mail and saw that it was post-dated weeks old. They decided to go back home instead of continuing to the river. My dad went over to the home of Mr. Bogner and knocked, but Mr. Bogner didn't come to the door. He decided to request a welfare check. Later that evening, an officer called my dad to report that Mr. Bogner had passed away several weeks prior, based on his condition in the bathroom. My dad told me that buzzards had been flying around the home recently too, when he thought back. For some reason, it wasn't realized why until that moment. They were there because of poor Mr. Bogner. Buzzards were common due to it being a heavy deer population area, and they were often hunted or hit by cars. Weeks later, my dad found out a few things. The first thing was that it was very common for Mr. Bogner not to check his mail, so it didn't raise any big concerns when the mail carrier continued piling mail in his already full mailbox. Another thing was that Mr. Bogner did not have any living blood relatives to be concerned of his missing. He had a stepson who passed away, and the stepson's wife ended up taking possession of his things and having to make arrangements for him. The third thing my dad found out was the condition of his home. Apparently, he was a bit of a trash hoarder. There were dozens and dozens of empty cardboard food containers, pizza boxes, and TV dinner trays. The story is very tragic, and I felt sad that he had no one looking for him when I found that out. They were not able to do a normal autopsy due to how long he had been left, but they assumed it was a medical emergency, such as a heart attack. I just hope that he went quickly and that he didn't suffer by himself.